Okay, I think we'll make a start, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's session, which is digital research infrastructure for healthy communities. I think what we've seen throughout this meeting, just the increasingly pivotal role that digital infrastructure is playing in all areas, but it's particularly crucial, I think, in the area of health and medical research. And what I hope to do in this session is to explore the latest innovations in digital research infrastructure and their transformative implications for building healthier communities. And I have a wonderful panel here of quite diverse expertise in Tim Hubbard, Graham Jackson, Maren Smith, and Wojtek Gosinski. I'm going to ask them each to introduce themselves, where they're based, and a very high-level description of the kinds of things that they're doing, and you'll see that level of diversity. I'll ask a few questions, and then I really would like to get some good audience participation. You've got all these guys up here, now's your chance to grill them, so I think that's our opportunity. So I might start with you, Tim, if you can just tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do and where your interests lie.
Okay, is the microphone on? Yeah?
Yep.
Right, so I'm Tim Hubbard, I'm director of Elixir. Elixir is the pan-European research infrastructure for all biological data. But I've only been director for 6 months, so I'm relatively new. Prior to that, I was seconded to Genomics England and Health Data Research UK, which are UK organisations which have been involved in getting genomes into the health service in the UK and making health data accessible for research. And I think one of the key things I want to emphasise is building infrastructure that faces both ways simultaneously. So Genomics England infrastructure provides analysis directly into the health system for whole genomes and makes that data accessible to researchers in a secure environment in such a way that if the researchers find something for a patient where the genome is not understood, they can send a message back directly to clinical care. So having dual purpose infrastructure, I think, is important. The other thing in Health Connection is I'm on the technical advisory group of WHO for genomics, and we've just published, there's a roadmap document published in Nature Medicine, but more significantly, there's a guidance document that just came out in the last month, laying out how to do data sharing, what things you need to consider worldwide, because we'd like to encourage genomics adoption worldwide for healthcare.
Tim, thank you. Graham.
Hello. Yep. Yeah, my name's Graham Jackson. I'm a neurologist who treats patients primarily with epilepsy. I am also the clinical director of the Florey Institute, which is a large neuroscience institute based in Melbourne. And I'm a researcher who had a commitment early on to understand how the brain works. And my chosen high technology that I'd apply to clinical problems was MR research. So I got fascinated with MR as a young registrar when there was a 0.3 phoner Tesla scanner put into Melbourne, and I said we need to see what's going on in the brain instead of spending all that time as neurologists working out where the problem is. We needed to work out what the problem is and what to do with it. Now I'm also the principal investigator of one of the Australian Medical Research Future Fund Frontiers programs, and that's a large investment in epilepsy. And my infrastructure interest here is that I have the belief that many of the patients that we see in a specialist centre in epilepsy, say at the Austin Hospital, we can assess 100 patients a year and we operate and cure epilepsy in about 20 a year. And it's postcode medicine on the old model of health where hospitals deal with random expertise they happen to have there and do the best they can. We're in an era now that I believe that infrastructure has changed things so that we can expand expertise through digital enhancement to population scale. We don't have to have an expert in every town. We have to have informed digital information, and my mission is really to take a model of healthcare into the century we're currently in and use that digital infrastructure to meet people in their homes, to have diagnostic information at the start of the disease, and democratise this so that it's happening at population scale. So to do that, obviously, it's the infrastructure era that we've just entered, and all the things we've been talking about in this meeting. And I have to confess that I'm one of those clinicians that got a grant in AI, knowing nothing about it, but I've got a really good AI team.
Thanks, Graham. Merrin.
Hello everyone, I'm Merrin Smith. I'm the Chief Executive of the Population Health Research Network, or PHRN for short. And just a quick reminder, it's not the Public Health Research Network, it's the Population Health Research Network. And our focus is on the linkage of data across the Australian population at the individual person level. And that data is used for a whole range of health and medical research. So I've been in the role since 2009, so that's quite a while. Prior to that, I was in the WA Department of Health for about 25 years in a range of roles, including running something called the Health Information Centre, which ran the Western Australian Data Linkage Unit. And with the help of our fantastic research infrastructure funder, we were able to roll that model out across Australia. The topic of this discussion is around healthy communities, and in my opinion, the key to healthy communities is population data, and that includes health data, from the very basic data like births and deaths to hospitalisations, emergency department attendances, cancer registry data, and other types of health data, plus other types of human services data. And the postcode's really important in that, around the social determinants of health. So to understand people's the early childhood development index, so at age 3, where is a child on the development index? Because what happens in the perinatal period and that early childhood period will inform the health trajectory of that child. And of course, the good news is it provides opportunities for intervention. So I guess that's saying I think population health data is enormously important. It's not the whole story, but it's a good place to begin.
Merrin, thank you. Wojtek.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you, everybody. My name is Wojtek Kaczynski. I'm CEO of National Imaging Facility. For most of my career, I've really worked at the interface of physical instrumentation and digital tools and techniques in the life sciences. National Imaging Facility is Australia's advanced imaging network. So we're responsible for delivering advanced biomedical imaging infrastructure across Australia and our 14 partners. We provide animal imaging capabilities, we provide human imaging capabilities in a university context and in a clinical context as well. And really any of the technologies that you might yourself get done at a hospital when you get sick to get imaged, we provide the advanced versions of that specifically for research. Modalities such as medical resonance imaging, as Graham mentioned, PET, and others. We provide the physical research infrastructure that Graham's project uses for his studies. We have a dedicated national data program, and that's a new capability within the NIF because we were largely a physical research infrastructure initially. And we do have a data goal. It's a very simple goal. Our job is to provide researchers with the advanced imaging data collections that they need to answer challenging medical research questions. And it's a relatively simple goal, but there's a lot to it when we actually go to deliver it. We need a physical infrastructure that spans Australia to provide researchers with access to population when they're scanning. We need digital tools and infrastructure to support the data that's generated. We need excellent expertise and analysis infrastructure to analyse our data. And we need excellent community and relationships across Australia as well.
Thanks very much, Wojtek. So I'm going to ask the panel a series of questions. And to make this session really work, one is, obviously, I think all the panel will be happy to answer questions, but I look around this room and I see an awful lot of expertise in the room as well. So if the people want to make a comment to add to what is being said, please feel free to do so. So questions and comments will be gratefully received. Wojtek, I might start with you. So where do you see the importance of embedding data use and data integration into the culture of research infrastructures and doing it from the beginning, not as an afterthought?
Really great question. Before I was in my current role, I was responsible for high-performance computing at a major Australian university. So I don't originally have an imaging background. I have a digital background, and I'm a computer scientist. And it's a really interesting problem to be supporting advanced digital research infrastructure, because you are really running at speed to try to keep up with physical research infrastructure, with science, with community, and with the needs of the researchers around you. So to take an example, we were responsible for delivering the digital infrastructure that was needed for the university to enter the cryo-EM revolution that was occurring. We heard from the previous panel, there was a comment about the explosion of digital data in the sort of 2000s and onwards. Cryo-EM is a major part of that. It's a huge opportunity to revolutionize structural biology. It's also a brand new technique, producing very new types of data sets that scientists from a wet lab had never dealt with before. And so there was a really interesting situation occurring where the instrumentation was improving very quickly, very significant expectations on analysis environments and the digital infrastructure. The tools were changing very rapidly and were being upgraded on a weekly basis. And the community itself were learning as they went along as well. And all of those sort of things were happening in parallel. It wasn't just one, it was everything occurring at the one time. And in this situation, preparation is obviously critical, and really we mean capacity and budget and people and the ability to have people there and the capacity to process this data. But one thing we very much learnt very quickly is that there is no solution to these challenges, and that really it's more of an iterative approach that works in this situation where you're continually improving an environment and continually trying to work in a sort of co-design model with the research community, with the infrastructure provider, and to continue improving what you're providing to the research community as you're going in an iterative fashion. And I tend to take this sort of approach still now with what we do. Yes, we need to prepare in advance for these revolutions that are occurring. We also need to work very collaboratively and continue operating in an iterative manner as we go.
Thanks, Wojtek. So Maren, data privacy, it's a current issue, and we all see privacy as having several considerations, including ethical, legal, social implications. In Australia, health data use is governed by a range of legislation, not just privacy legislation, and use must be lawful, ethical, and acceptable to the community. So do you want to expand on that a little bit and some of the challenges that you're facing in that area?
Yes, excuse me, thanks, Ian. So we're talking about sensitive data. Yep. It's data from everybody in this room, and it needs to be handled in ways that are lawful, ethical, and acceptable to the community. And sometimes we call that ELSI. So if we start with a legal framework, as some of you will know, but perhaps not everybody, Australia is a federation. We have 6 states, 2 territories, and an Australian government. And each state, territory and Australian government has privacy legislation, and most of them, which is sort of subtly different. They're sort of similar but not the same. Each jurisdiction, or most jurisdictions, have health records legislation. They sometimes have data sharing arrangements. So in Australia it's pretty complex. I suspect it's not quite as complex as the EU, so perhaps we're lucky in that regard. But you need to start with the law. And the good news is you don't need to understand all about it. It's actually so complex that there's probably just a handful of people in Australia that really know and understand how to navigate it. And the other good news is it is possible to navigate it and link data and use data for research in ways that are lawful. Ethics is also an issue. I think in Australia the ethics committee arrangements are pretty good. Ethics committees are pretty structured. They've got sort of structured processes. We've got a National Health and Medical Research Council that provides guidance. And perhaps the biggest challenge for the ethics committees at the moment is AI. So ethics committees sort of struggle when they've got to weigh up the risks from use of the data to the benefits from the use. And sometimes when you're starting out with AI, you've got a lot of great ideas, but you don't know which one's going to work. So it can be quite hard for ethics committees to really weigh that up. And in fact, we think ethics committees need guidance, and we're just in the process of putting in a funding request for a partnership grant to the Asian MRC to help develop more guidance for ethics committees. And that, last but not least, is what's acceptable to the community. And the community can quite surprise you when you actually ask them what they think you should be doing with their health data. To some extent, if you sort of ask them, they're quite surprised that government agencies are not already using it, and they think they should be using it. But if you then ask them about their general practice data, they might be a little bit more reluctant, because they may just have been to see their GP last week and they may have said something sort of quite sensitive, and they may be more reluctant. So when we use linked population data, and that is linked at the individual person level across the Australian population without consent, it definitely needs to be done in ways that are lawful, ethical and acceptable to the community.
Maren, thank you. Just to build on that a little bit, Graham, the challenges in collaboration and sharing data repositories and tools, how can these be shared internationally without sort of necessarily reinventing the wheel? But you've got the added complication, of course, of sensitive clinical data as opposed to other data.
Thank you for raising that. So I'm sitting here from the position of having started to actually try and do this from 2019, doing it, it's harder than knowing what to do. So I think that's my first comment. I remember after many years I raised $9 million and got the first 3 Tesla MRI scanner in Southern Hemisphere, and we turned it on and did some language fMRI, and there was some publicity about this, and I got a speech pathologist from upcountry come down into my office and say he's had this fantastic idea, we could use this machine to see where language was in the brain. I said, so what do you want to do? He said, well, it's my research project. And he tried to sue me because we'd already done it, and it was his idea. So my whole point of this is implementation is really key to a lot of what we're talking about. It's easy to know what to do, but how to do it, as I said, is hard. And there are some elements of that, and it starts with what is your purpose. When I first started, I didn't know much about AI. So there was an Institute of AI in Melbourne, and there were some overseas places. I went to them to look at all the technology and said, well, can you be part of the project? We've got money. And they had these fantastic systems. I think, I don't want to offend anyone, but Watson was sort of one of them. And, there was this data management layer and this layer and that layer. And I couldn't work out, A, how to use it for the purpose I wanted, or how to pay for it, and what the model was in the end of what we were going to do with the data once it went through this fancy machine. So their infrastructure has to be part of a linear purpose that is driven by a partnership between those trying to do something and those who enable the doing. And that's true of all my research over my career. I've always worked with a physicist. I've always said, I want to know about white matter pathways in the brain. There's no way to do it, Graham. Okay, that's our research then. And bringing new technologies to an old problem that hasn't yet been properly solved is the partnership between infrastructure and purpose. And I think, the example I've used to people is Amazon's got all this fantastic technology, but it would be like us in infrastructure saying, let's just build a fantastic warehouse that's got all this automation without knowing what the rest of the supply chain, where are things manufactured, which is the discovery science, you know, and where are things sold, you know, in a retail, which is really implementation, health and wealth change. You know, that's where someone's going to actually give you money for this whole supply chain. So keeping an eye on the whole chain is really important. Now, going back to what we've done in this space, it's not. I will also mention that I don't think we would have got there. I did a law degree without ever practicing law before I did medicine, so I sort of understood we've got to get all this foundational stuff in place. Privacy on its own is complex. A data transfer across state boundaries is complex. So following regulations, you know, getting compliance right, having the underlying agreements right. The legal layers of this is really infrastructure in its own right. So even after you've got that, there is a social component to network behaviour and infrastructure. The social component is, I mean, I call it the NIH always blocks things, and I don't mean the American NIH, I mean not invented here. I didn't know about it, no one told me, I wasn't included. All these things, it's amazing how it can block implementation. So in our project, we need 4,000 patients across all the states of Australia. We need the data to flow centrally in an identified manner for research purposes. And that's actually working now, but I can't tell you how many steps there were in doing that. So that's a whole infrastructure component that I'm not sure we are fully connected to. And I would recommend that this experience needs to be bundled together an infrastructure component of how to do things in its own right, because it's the soft expertise. It's easy to solve the hard expertise, like how does the machine go ping, but the soft expertise that makes all the pieces connect is really where a massive amount of the work goes in. So that's the state Australian level. The international level, in some ways, we have one group in London that we've managed to get all the legal arrangements for management of data, but it's very clear that all around the world, no one's going to accept data going outside their country or on servers outside their country. I don't think we'll ever get across that, but we do have to have the infrastructure where people can come in with algorithms and interrogate data, remotely, and the final thing I'd say is we are in an amazing era as a clinician. COVID brought things forward that are possible by many, many years, because if I want to see an 89-year-old patient of mine who lives in Albury, they all know how to use Zoom because they've all got grandkids and they've all worked it out. So everyone in our society can use this stuff now, and it's a huge opportunity for digital and connecting into these bigger digital environments. It starts with being willing, and I think it is possible. It's the elements that I see as paying attention to. And you do need, clinicians like me who take the last mile from the infrastructure to the patient and the decision as to what to do with them.
Graham, thank you. Tim, I think you probably face similar sorts of challenges. I just wonder if you'd tell us something about the WHO genomics project that you've been involved in, and I'm sure you could probably spend hours talking about it, but I think it's fascinating. I think just to give the audience a bit of insight, and then to talk about some of the challenges that you faced along the way in terms of implementation.
So I think I'll start with the 1 Million Genomes project, which is the UK, it's the EU plan to sequence 1 million genomes across EU member states. And of course, once you start thinking about that, you've got to start thinking about this problem of the data coming from different countries. So Elixir is not doing medicine, but it is coordinating the infrastructure for this 1 Million Genomes project, the Genome Data Infrastructure funded project. And the genomes are just about to start flowing because Genomes of Europe, which is another block of funding, is about to start generating these genomes. So these genomes have to be stored somewhere, and it's, because the initial batch is coming through research consortia, cohorts of various sorts. They'll probably be under research consents, some of which will allow them to move around. But all of this is partly towards this vision in Europe for the European health data space, where you're going to start, you build infrastructure now, that infrastructure is going to end up supporting genomes which are being collected from a healthcare side and making them available for research. And once you start doing that, they're probably not going to move across national boundaries, which means this infrastructure that we're building has to be able to support federation. I think that really is, that's the difference between the 1 Million Genomes Project and what's been done in the UK, the Genomics England integration with the health system, where there is a single data storage, it's 100 petabytes. It provides the clinical care based on whole genomes for rare disease and cancer in the NHS, and a data store which can be interpreted by researchers. But in Europe, it's going to have to be a set of secure processing environments which somehow are linked together so that you can do federated analysis. And the federated analysis is not straightforward. You know, can you make it easy for researchers not just to log into one trusted research environment, but to, at the sort of meta-analysis level, press a button and algorithms go out and run in all these different environments and then aggregate the summary results, which you can export, and end up with, you know, some information. And from the point of view of what the sort of part of this panel, you know, can you then also run algorithms on within countries or regions of countries for local population health management based on either genomes, because this is genomes at the start, but the European Health Data Space regulation is thinking about everybody's health records, 430 million, and an obligation for healthcare systems to make that data accessible. So you're talking about federation for genomes, you're talking about federations for clinical data and the infrastructure for that. Now, the WHO, this technical advisory group for genomics, it's really about, it's coming from the science committee of the WHO saying genomics is getting to a stage where there are going to be genomics-based treatments that are going to be relevant to everybody in the world, regardless of what sort of health system you've got. There are some forerunners to this. Obviously, GA4GH is an organization for standards across genomics. But then you've got G2MC, which has sort of existed in parallel, a set of health systems which are interested in deploying genomics for personalized medicine. That's around 30 countries, and they range, you know, obviously from European countries which have got established genome medicine operations to places like Thailand, which are using genome medicine for things like Stevens-Johnson syndrome, where you need to do a test on HLA because if you treat for a skin disease, in this particular case, you know, some of the patients will drop dead if they've got, or quite likely to if they're treated with certain drugs. So there's a wide interest across WHO countries, and this technical group is first stage is producing guidance documents on all the things you need to consider. If we can make the 1 Million Genomes Project work in the EU across, you know, 27 member states with a federated structure, that federated structure can potentially be used worldwide because it's all based on the data doesn't move out of those countries. So it's less scary from a privacy and also from a you know, data piracy, sort of benefit sharing sort of point of view. So it could become a model because we do need to have access to genomes from across the world. You know, all countries have got, you know, minorities, and those are not represented in the genomes we know. So interpretation of genomes for clinical care is going to vary according to the amount of genome information we have. We really need to have a much more unified set of data across the world. And if we can make this federated framework work in the EU, then I think that federated structure could be rolled out worldwide.
Thanks, Tim. I note we've got some of Australia's best bioinformaticians within the audience. Are there any comments or questions around what we've heard so far? Any potential solutions to some of the challenges?
Graham, I guess I'll probably direct this question towards you. I mean, in light of what you explained, the trials and tribulations of getting to your kind of applied translation of your project, I mean, in Australian context, do you think that without actual legislative intervention, we're really going to reach the aspirations of personalised medicine in the current way it's structured?
Yeah, I'll make a couple of comments about that. If you go down the legislative pathway and the regulatory pathway, no, you can't do it. It's just we really do need political wisdom and at least a lobby group to clean up some of the regulation. Because even if you look like you're totally compliant with one act, there's another act somewhere else you're in breach of. And I think it's only because it doesn't get enforced and no one knows about it that it actually works. If you actually read everything that's out there that someone has legislated at some stage, it gets scary. The reason I have some hope is Australia is very friendlier to research. So if I was to set up ours as a for-profit company, and as a medical software device have to be TGA approved, the costs to have got that to that point and the inability to change it after you did get to that point, it would be impossible. But if we go through the research route and do sort of TGA notification through the consented patients, through a research environment, with a recognition that research is part of clinical care, then there is a pathway to do it on a national scale, and that's the needle we've sort of threaded, if you like. I just want to make another comment to you about AI in the clinical space, because that's also regulated in some ways. I'm a clinician, right, and we have clinical meetings about patients. And the physicists in the group are always scared, say, oh, we've used this new technique and we've got an orange blob here that says that bit of the brain may be doing something. Oh, we can't show it to the clinicians, otherwise it may operate on the wrong part of the brain. Clinicians aren't stupid in some ways. I've always shown our research stuff in the clinical meetings. And I'm always encouraged when people say, can you show me that again? And then sometimes we show them techniques and they look at it and no one's interested because the clinicians are using their own version of assisted intelligence to work out whether something is meaningful. And in every aspect of the AEP, we've got artificial intelligence at many levels, judging whether a person's got a suicide risk, so we make them see them earlier. There's AI there's 100 AI algorithms in what we do. Ultimately, we want to have a prediction of how likely is someone to have another seizure, or how likely are they not, so they can go driving. Things that, if you ask me as an AI, if you have a seizure this afternoon and come see me, what's the likelihood of another seizure? My best predictive device is a coin. I toss it and say it's heads, so it's 50-50, right? We have to do better than that. But I think the whole AI in the clinical context is sort of, the boogeyman stuff is not going to happen for a very, very long time. It's going to be assisted intelligence, and part of the human intelligence that's behind that is clearly part of the system. I don't think we need to be as scared as people make out. Clinicians will use this information, because at the end of that whole pathway that we're talking about, which is advice, there has to be a decision for action, and that decision for action is going to come through doctors, basically.
So in terms of this, the question about can you deploy it in a kind of legal framework, I mean, that is what has been done in the UK now, because the 100,000 Genomes Project in Genomics England started, it really was the whole thing is dressed up as a NHS transformation project, but it was a research-framed structure to investigate whether you got enough value for clinical care out of sequencing whole genomes. So there was a whole lot of health economics that was done in parallel, and that produced evidence that, yes, it was health effective. And then the Genome Medicine Service got created out of that. And of course, when we built the original structure, it was a little bit sellotape and string. It's now been hardened. It's a regulated clinical device in terms of the algorithm, and it has full ISO accreditation in terms of change control management. I mean, you can modify the algorithms if you've got the right framework. It's very, it's quite heavy to do all that, but it is possible. And now it's a permanent structure of the NHS, whole genome sequencing, and there is a testing directory that goes all the way from single gene tests to whole genome sequencing, which is revised annually. And so Genomics England, it's kind of doing three functions. It's providing a clinical service to the NHS, whole genome interpretation. It's providing a research environment with the same data, and even the NHS patients now, I think it's more than 95% are consenting for their data to be in this secure environment for research. And then third thing is it's doing special projects to see what other uses of whole genomes can you then find evidence for, because then you can use the testing directory reevaluation to feed them back into clinical care and have that rolled out nationally. And the big project that's being done at the moment is newborns. If we sequence patients newborn, then you're kind of predicting rather than interpreting what's wrong with them. Can you predict enough rare disease cases at birth instead of when they present with symptoms, when there's more chance of having an early intervention? Is there enough clinical value in that? If there is, then that means sequencing at birth will be offered nationally, and you'll have genomes stored for everyone, which then means you'll get all this other benefit of interpretation during the lifetime. So that's the structure that's been set up and is a permanent structure.
If I can just make a comment there, that's remarkable. I didn't know about that, but it models exactly what we're doing, because the refractory epilepsy, everyone thinks that's the sort that we used to look at in these fancy meetings. I was talking high resource meetings and high expertise meetings. But the other half of our project is to look at people after their first seizure and predict, because the chance of intervention and long-term benefit is the same. And clearly, we are planning to go exactly the pathway you were. So I'm glad that there is a model there. But it also says to me that partnerships between purposes like this, the genomes or the brain diseases or any other diseases, partnerships with those clinicians, and I think it's clinicians at population scale, not institutions for healthcare, research entities that really can manage these infrastructure elements, and the infrastructure is the type of platform you've got to think about rather than the elements that make up a platform. And it sounds to me like that's exactly what you've done.
Okay. Graham, did you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I suppose it's... Thanks, Ian. I suppose it's an extension of that, and I'm thinking about, in the context of collaborative research infrastructure, what are we doing to ensure that we, as discussed before, the democratisation of healthcare, that it's not restricted to those people that happen to live in a postcode, and how do we ensure, whether that be at genomics or at disease level or population levels, that our wider community is benefit, and we have the impact of that research at scale?
So in the UK, if you look at UK Biobank, which is a research cohort, of course that's volunteers. It's biased, in terms of the ethnic subgroups, etc., etc. If you look at the Genomics England set, it's just patients who are ill in the health service, and the health service is universal. And if you look at the breakdown there, it exactly matches the population. So in terms of accessibility, it's through the health system. Of course, in terms of the collection of genomes we have, ethnic subgroups are there's not enough of them for good interpretation, which is why we need this worldwide, sharing of data or access to data so that we can learn more about the patterns.
Yeah, and I think our model of healthcare that we live in Australia got invented about 100 years ago and hasn't basically changed. So it may be a little bit dated. We don't want to be rude to the healthcare system, but what we're doing in the epilepsy context is we've redesigned everything so we meet people in the home and do everything in the home. So we take their history there, they fill in their questionnaires with someone, you know, on a Zoom-like call, and we've modified all of the neuropsychology so that it's all computer done, but with someone watching. So it's more like the clinical environment, but it's in their home. And the only reason for bricks and mortar environments is for high-level diagnostics. So you go there once to get your MRI scan or whatever test you need, and then you go back there when you need an interventional therapy. So we've had no problems with people from anywhere in the country will come from the Northern Territory for a single event. I used to be a country neurologist, and although no one would ever come to the city to see a neurologist, they'd drive from Bega or up near Sydney to me 1 hour out of Melbourne because I was a country neurologist. And people will drive for one-offs, but routine care can now be done in a democratised way. So even if you're rural and regional, or if you're in a distant site, one episode of travel, you know, seems very appropriate to nearly everyone in Australia and very possible. So I think that's the democratisation. So not all your care is in one spot. You've got bricks and mortar specialised needs. And I think I've said this before, but I actually don't think the healthcare can reform itself from inside itself. It's too much looking after, you know, the next Weiss separation for an episode in emergency. I think the healthcare model of care is going to be changed by the tech companies. I think the Googles, the Amazons, the Apples, you know, after they've finished with all the other gadgets, they'll realise there's money in healthcare, and they might as well take that over as well. You know, so I suspect the model I'm talking about really is an infrastructure, high-tech future, because I don't think we can sustain the costs of our bricks and mortar system that we've got at the moment.
Perhaps I could say I think the other factor is digital clinical data. So it's been a long time coming, and it's a journey like so many things in health, but hospitals at last, public health systems across the states are beginning to look at a more systematic approach to standardising the electronic health record data. And I think when that data can come into a repository and actually be analysed by AI rather than people, then you can build the models of evidence of care that will enable care to be delivered irrespective of postcode. So I think there's hope for the system.
Of course, in Europe, there is this regulation which has been passed by the Parliament, which is going to mandate all health systems in Europe to make their data accessible for secondary analysis. I mean, that's a massive thing. That there is going to be an opt-out, so there will be sensitivity about privacy. You know, I think this will block national transfers across boundaries. But it's, you know, it's a huge juggernaut that I'm not sure all health ministries are fully aware, or health systems across Europe are fully aware of what they're going to have to do to make that work. Obviously, there are lots and lots of different pilots with clinical data, some of it linked to the genomic side, but this is 430 million people potentially, where the data is going to be accessible for research analysis.
Any questions or comments? I might change gears a little bit, Wojtek. The issue that you raised earlier, and I know this firsthand, a lot of the universities are struggling when they import some of the more sophisticated imaging equipment, and it'll be happening in the clinical environment too. And there's now a considerable cost impost in terms of getting the appropriate computational capability to be able to store, curate, and analyse that data. And I guess my question to you, given that you ran the massive supercomputer at Monash, is there a place now for tier 2 compute as well as tier 1 computers? It's a sort of an old argument, but I'm just seeing so many institutions now struggling to get the kind of computing power that's necessary to do things like cryo-EM, and particularly when you're into tomography and things like that. Just wondered if you had a view on that, and I'd be interested in the audience view on that as well.
Yeah, and can I maybe rephrase the question a little bit, which is to ask, is there a place for tier 2 within the sort of national funding landscape?
Yep.
because already Tier 2 exists, right? So it you know, we ran Tier 2. Lots of universities run Tier 2 and at that scale. And look, I think the answer is yes, there absolutely is. I think Tier 2 is most effective under certain circumstances, and particularly when it's specialised for specific purposes. I think that's something that we always did well, and I think other universities have adopted that model quite effectively as well across Australia. So I think in that context, there's a place. One thing that really interests me in that question also is, what's the purpose of national investment into Tier 2? I mean, obviously there's an argument to be made about just scale up, just a simple scale up argument. A university has a unique capability, it has specialised, it would be great to offer that nationally. That's obviously a valid argument, but I think there's another argument just about the Australian landscape and the challenges navigating the Australian landscape. And, you know, the purpose of, you know, Commonwealth investment into this really, in my mind, should be to create an easier landscape between facilities, an aligned landscape between Tier 1 and Tier 2, so that actually everybody understands what's the purpose and structure of the landscape. I think actually it's timely to be talking about some of this, considering some of the considerations that are being made.
But can that Tier 2 infrastructure support privacy-controlled structures? I mean, we had some investments years ago where it was meant to be for medical research, but of course a lot of the data was then privacy-controlled, couldn't be put in those environments, and so it couldn't be used for that purpose unless they were proper research subjects as opposed to clinical data. So I think there's, you know, the building these infrastructures that are able to do, say, AI computing, but in a secure way, is a big issue.
And it's a different landscape than it was even a few years ago. That, I mean, just the requirements for, you know, a computer, a HPC system specifically for the life sciences and healthcare research is a really different thing from what you might have pitched 5 years ago. There's this need for AI. There's a need for, you know, the privacy requirement, and everybody understands the concept of a trusted research environment now, or a safe haven. And there's I think also a need for accreditation at the ISO 27001 level and these sort of requirements. So it's not a cheap enterprise actually at all to undertake all of this. It's quite significant. But I do think that's actually what's needed to do, you know, really effective AI research in a healthcare setting.
Any comments from the audience about Tier 2, Tier 1 compute? No?
I've just got one comment, not being in the audience, but just to say, I think the comment was made, perhaps it was yesterday, that health is not as big as astronomy in terms of its data size, and that's really true. But by the time you get the genomics data, other omics data, and imaging and population data, it's getting to that scale, and then you put AI on top of that. So effectively, in my view, we need accreditation in our supercomputers.
Yep. I mean, Genomics England infrastructure is now 100 petabytes, and that's only for, what, 200,000 genomes? It probably could be a bit more efficient, but it's still a massive, massive amount of data. And
as more genetic information is being collected in routine clinical care,
exactly.
We've got a lot now. In 5 years, there's going to be a lot more.
I just make a comment as a clinician, is that one of the things we have to look at is data reduction. Because, for example, I don't know how many pixel data we collect in an hour and a half of MR imaging with 15 minutes of fMRI and all that stuff. But just having data and leaving it to AI to sort it out from raw data is probably, I don't think, the long-term future. I think there's a lot of research and infrastructure to work out what are the summary parameters that characterise things of interest. Do we collapse it down to gene level data? Do we collapse it down into protein pathway data that's a consequence of the genome, and then that's what we put into the AI compute? Because it's also a question of it's very real that big data's a lot of data's not big data. I've seen the data from, there was a big project with Microsoft in the Austin for collecting all the data, and the data is so variable that the AI is just a hallucinating beast. The way you collect the data becomes critical. So I think this pathway of both data collection, and don't just leave it as raw data. The inputs aren't all the raw data, and AI will deal with it, mate. You've got to do sensible data reduction. You've got to have, you've got to almost use science and have hypotheses behind it. What's the cognitive domain as opposed to all the cognitive tests, correlation, and so on. And genomics may end up being SNP and polygenic risk score rather than with synthetic genomes rather than the actual genomes and things like that.
This is an area where I think physics has done a better job. They've got the streams coming off their particle acceleration, they throw most of it away. They've worked out how to do that. We haven't been so good in biology, I think, at data reduction.
Okay, well, look, we're reaching we had a 50-minute time period. We've got now 51 minutes. But is there a question or a comment that anybody in the audience would like to make as the end of this? If not, then please join me in thanking our excellent panelists. Thank you.